Scary telling.
As I stepped out of the time machine, I was greeted by a sight that filled me with horror. The ground was covered in ash and debris, and there were burned bodies scattered everywhere. The smell of smoke and death filled my nostrils, making me gag. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. I had traveled 100 years into the future, but the world I saw was nothing like the one I had left behind. Everything was destroyed, and the only thing that remained was the horror and devastation that lay before me. I stumbled forward, my legs weak and unsteady. I recognized some of the buildings around me. They were the ones I had known in my own time. But they were unrecognizable now, reduced to twisted wreckage and rubble. As I walked through the ruins, I realized that I had caused this. My actions in the past had somehow led to the destruction of the world. I felt sick to my stomach, consumed by guilt and horror. The bodies were the worst part. They were everywhere, lying in the streets and piled up against the buildings. Some were burned beyond recognition, while others were twisted and mangled. I tried not to look at them, but they seemed to be everywhere I turned. As I wandered through the ruins, I began to realize the enormity of what had happened. This wasn't just a disaster or a catastrophe, it was the end of the world. And I had caused it. I tried to make my way back to the time machine, hoping that I could somehow undo what I had done. But when I got there, I realized that it was no use. The machine was damaged beyond repair, and I was stuck here in this ruined world. I sank to the ground, overwhelmed by despair. How had I been so foolish? How had I not seen the consequences of my actions? The truth was, I had been so focused on the science and the technology that I had failed to think about the human cost. I had been blinded by my own ambition, and now I was paying the price. As I sat there in the ruins, I realized that there was no going back. I couldn't undo what I had done, and I couldn't fix the world that I had destroyed. All I could do was try to survive in this new, horrible reality and hope that somehow, someday, I could find a way to make amends for what I had done. I couldn't escape the guilt that consumed me as I wandered through the ruins of the world I had destroyed. Everywhere I looked, I saw the destruction and death that was my doing. The burned bodies, the twisted wreckage, the ruins of once great cities, they were all a testament to my own folly. I tried to focus on finding a way to fix my mistake, but it seemed impossible. The devastation was so complete that there was nothing left to salvage. All I could do was walk through the ruins, searching for any clues or artifacts that might help me change the course of history. But the more I looked, the more hopeless I became. The scale of the disaster was beyond anything I had imagined, and I realized that there was nothing I could do to undo what I had done. As I walked through the ruins, I was haunted by visions of the people I had known and loved, all burned and broken by my own actions. I saw the faces of my parents, my siblings, my friends, all staring at me with accusing eyes. I tried to push the visions away, but they only grew stronger. They followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of the terrible mistake I had made. I started to wonder if I even deserved to survive in this new world. Maybe it would be better if I just died, if I paid the ultimate price for my hubris. But then I remembered something, the emergency rations I had brought with me. They were still in the time machine, untouched by the devastation. I could survive here, even if it was just a miserable existence. So I gathered up what I could find: water bottles, canned food, a flashlight, and set out to find a place to shelter. I stumbled upon a partially collapsed building and managed to find a room that was relatively intact. It would have to do. As I sat there in the darkness, eating cold beans out of a can, I realized that I was alone. Completely and utterly alone in this ruined world. The guilt and despair washed over me, threatening to drown me. But then something inside me shifted. I realized that I couldn't give up. I couldn't let my own guilt consume me. I had to find a way to make things right, to find a way to redeem myself. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that I had to try. I had caused this disaster, and it was up to me to fix it, or at least to try. With that thought in mind, I drifted off to sleep, exhausted and terrified, but determined to make things right. As I woke up the next morning, I realized that I had to start somewhere if I was going to try to fix my mistake. I couldn't just sit in my makeshift shelter and wait for something to happen. I had to take action. I stepped out into the ruins of the city, the sun rising slowly over the horizon. The destruction was still as complete as it had been the day before, but now I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't had before. I walked through the streets, looking for any signs of life or civilization. At first, I found nothing but ruins and ash. But as I walked further, I began to find evidence of human activity, scraps of food, discarded clothing, makeshift shelters. As I walked, I began to encounter other survivors. They were wary and mistrustful of me at first, but as I explained who I was and what I had done, they began to understand the enormity of the situation. Together, we began to search for anything that might help us survive in this new world. We scrounged for food and water, explored the ruins for supplies, and tried to piece together what had happened. It was a difficult and dangerous life, but for the first time since I had arrived in this future world, I felt like I was making progress. I wasn't just a passive observer of the destruction, I was an active participant in the effort to rebuild. As I worked with the other survivors, I began to feel a sense of community that I hadn't experienced before. We were all in this together, trying to survive and make the best of a terrible situation. But even as we worked together, I couldn't escape the guilt that still haunted me. Every burned building, every twisted body, was a reminder of my own mistake. I knew that I had caused this, and I couldn't just ignore the consequences of my actions. As we continued to search for a way to survive in this ruined world, I began to realize that I needed to do more. I needed to find a way to fix what I had done, to try to make amends for the destruction I had caused. It was a daunting task, but I knew that I couldn't just give up. I had to keep trying, keep searching for a way to set things right. And so, with a sense of determination and purpose, I set out to explore the ruins of the world that I had destroyed. As I continued to explore the ruins of the world I had destroyed, I felt a growing sense of despair. The devastation was so complete that it seemed impossible to find a way to fix it. No matter where I looked, all I saw was death and destruction. The guilt and horror of what I had done weighed heavily on me. I couldn't escape the visions of the burned bodies and twisted wreckage that filled my mind. Everywhere I turned, I was reminded of the disaster that I had caused. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The visions and hallucinations grew stronger until I couldn't tell what was real and what was in my head. I started to hear voices, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I knew that I was losing my mind, but I couldn't stop it. The guilt and despair were consuming me, and I felt like I was spiraling out of control. I started to question whether I even deserved to survive in this new world. Maybe it would be better if I just died, if I paid the ultimate price for my hubris. But then something shifted inside me. I realized that giving up wasn't the answer. I had to find a way to make amends for what I had done, to try to set things right. And so I continued to search the ruins, even as my mind slipped further and further into madness. I knew that I had to keep going, no matter what the cost. As I walked through the ruins, I began to have strange and terrifying visions. I saw things that couldn't possibly be real, ghosts and demons that seemed to be waiting for me at every turn. But through it all, I refused to give up. I kept searching, kept pushing myself to find a way to fix what I had done. And then, one day, I had a breakthrough. I found a small cache of supplies that included a piece of technology that might just be the key to fixing my mistake. With renewed purpose, I set out to find a way to use the technology to change the course of history. But even as I worked, I could feel my grip on reality slipping further away. The ghosts and demons were getting stronger, and I couldn't tell what was real and what was just in my head. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind for good. But even as I struggled with my own sanity, I knew that I couldn't give up. I had to find a way to fix my mistake, to try to make amends for what I had done. And so I continued to work, even as the darkness closed in around me. I didn't know if I would ever find a way to set things right, but I knew that I had to try. As I worked to try to fix my mistake, I could feel the ghosts and demons growing stronger around me. The guilt and despair were still with me, but now they were joined by a growing sense of madness. I knew that I had to find a way to fix things before it was too late. But the task seemed impossible. The technology one had found was old and damaged, and I had no idea how to make it work. But even as I struggled with my own demons, I refused to give up. I worked tirelessly, day and night, trying to figure out how to use the technology to change the course of history. And then, one day, I had a breakthrough. I discovered a way to use the technology to travel back in time to a point before the disaster had occurred. It was a risky and dangerous plan, but it was the only chance I had. I set the controls of the time machine, focusing all of my energy on the destination. I knew that if I succeeded, I could change the course of history and prevent the disaster that I had caused. The energy surged, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the journey to be over. When I opened them again, I was back in my own time, just moments before I had first stepped into the time machine. I knew what I had to do. I had to stop myself from making the mistake that had led to the disaster in the future. It would mean sacrificing everything I had worked for, but it was the only way. I ran through the halls of the lab, searching for my past self. When I finally found him, I knew that there was no turning back. I explained everything to him, the disaster, the guilt, the madness. I begged him not to make the same mistake I had made, to think about the human cost of the technology we were creating. At first, he didn't believe me. But as I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. He started to understand the enormity of what I was saying. And then, just as I thought it was too late, he nodded. He understood. He would change the course of history and prevent the disaster from ever occurring. As I watched him step into the time machine, I felt a sense of peace. It was over. I had redeemed myself in some small way. I had stopped the disaster before it could happen. As I walked away from the lab, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The ghosts and demons were gone, replaced by a sense of hope and purpose. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be many obstacles to overcome. But I was ready. I had learned my lesson, and I would never forget it. I had caused the disaster, but I had also fixed it. And in doing so, I had found a way to make amends for my mistake.